So far in the adventure of English, we've traced the story of the language through its first 1,000 years, from the 5th century to its great flowering at the time of Shakespeare. What began as a minor Germanic dialect had come to these shores with the Saxons, endured invasion by Vikings, and 300 years of suppression by Norman French, during which time English virtually went underground. It had even toppled Latin as the language of worship and philosophy, and by the Elizabethan age, English completely dominated this sceptred isle. But now, the English language was about to leave Britain. In the next 4 programmes, we'll tell the story of the way in which English became Britain's greatest export, some would say gift, to the modern world, and how it became a global language. We shall see how English travelled to India, where it encountered scores of other more ancient languages, including Sanskrit, which did much to mother our own tongue. Yet even at the end of our imperial rule in the mid-20th century, English remains in India as a major unifying tongue. We'll follow it to the West Indies, where new English dialects have been spawned, as rich and vigorous as the native ones used by Thomas Hardy and D.H. Lawrence. And to Australia, where once exiled English now reaches back to influence the youth of the mother country. But first to the New World, where 17th century Puritan English stubbornly beat off opposition from native tongues and rival European powers to become the language of what was to grow into the greatest country on earth, America. This was the newfound land. To the first settlers' eyes, this was a vast and it seemed empty space. And yet it's because of their first determined steps onto this soil nearly 400 years ago that English would one day speak for America. This is Plymouth Rock. It's literally the foundation stone of modern America. For this is the very spot where the Pilgrim Fathers landed in New England in November 1620. They came on the Mayflower. They were religious separatists, and they were here to create a new community where they could worship as they wished. They bound themselves to an oath, the Mayflower Compact, swearing to found a colony for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. They were, above all, people who lived by the word of God in English. They came from a hard-line Puritan religious tradition which had been persecuted and reviled. They'd been tortured and murdered for their faith in an English language Bible. And to them, that Bible, that language, meant life itself. They weren't the first people on the continent. Native Americans had been here for 30,000 years, and the woods and the plains rang with the sounds of hundreds of their languages. When the Pilgrim Fathers looked around them, instead of a new Eden, they saw what they described as a hideous and desolate wilderness, full of threat and danger.
And for the season it was winter, and they that know the winters of that country know them to be sharp and violent, and subject to cruel and fierce storms. Dangerous to travel to known places, much more to search an unknown coast. Besides, what could they see but a desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men? And what multitudes there might be of them, they knew not.
They were cold, hungry, and prey to sickness. Nearly half of the company of 144 died that first winter. It wasn't going to be easy to turn their oath into reality and to give English its toehold on the land. The Pilgrim Fathers had one advantage, though. They had come here to stay, and they wanted their settlement to be English. New England, they were to call it, but true England might have been more accurate. Their first move was to build a settlement, recreated here, Plymouth Plantation. They lived in terror of the supposedly wild men in the wilderness outside. But before they could even do that, they were to owe their survival to one of those wild men, and an extraordinary encounter with the English language.
And whilst we were busied hereabout, we were interrupted, for there presented himself a savage, which caused an alarm. He very boldly came all alone up to the houses, where we intercepted him, not suffering him to go in, as undoubtedly he would, out of his boldness. He saluted us in English, and bade us welcome.
So, welcome was the first word spoken by a native that the Pilgrim Fathers understood. The man who'd come out of the wilderness had picked up some words from the English fishermen who worked the coast. Even more extraordinarily, he was able to introduce them to Squanto, or Squanto as he became known. He is the most important man in this chapter of the adventure of English. He'd been kidnapped by English sailors 15 years before, taken to London where he was trained to be a guide and interpreter and learned English. Then he managed to escape on a return visit. To the colonists, it must have seemed like a miracle. It was the most unlikely of all coincidences that they should have settled near the tribal home of the man who was almost certainly the only English speaker for hundreds of miles around. But for their extraordinary good fortune, the whole history of America might have been very different. For Squanto saved the colony, and who knows, gave America the English language. Squanto taught the settlers how to farm the unfamiliar land, and he got them through that terrible first New England winter. It's almost certain that without him, sickness and hunger would have wiped out the settlers. Against all odds, the English colony had been saved by an encounter with the English language. The adventure had planted its roots in American soil. The settlers had a new country, full of new places and geographical features, new animals and plants. They needed words to describe them, and occasionally they turned to the native languages. Skunk was derived from the local language, and squash for the variety of pumpkin grown here. Squaw, meaning young woman, was a local word, as was papoose, a young child. And wigwam was another early borrowing from the local languages. But what's really remarkable is not that these words did enter the English vocabulary, but how few of them there were. For centuries, English had been borrowing words in their thousands from Latin, Danish, French, and every other language it had come into contact with. But here, faced with the richness of an entire continent, the English borrowed words not in thousands, but in handfuls. The writings of the Founding Fathers here run to thousands of pages, but contain less than a dozen borrowed Indian words. So why are there so few? In a strange new country, the English settlers may have taken great comfort in making the objects around them at least sound familiar. Look at the names they gave the local terrain: Falmouth, Yarmouth, Boston, Cambridge, Billericay, Bedford, Taunton. They were trying to recreate the English shires in the American wilderness. And perhaps there was desperation here, as well as determination. But through language, their own, they would survive, as they had in the old country. So they put a wall between themselves and the native world. In the end, we must conclude that they were here to impose their habits and their language on the land, not to be changed by it. Words, God's good English words, were at the heart of the lives of the settlers here. Improper speech was a crime. Blasphemy, slander, cursing, lying, perjury, railing, reviling, scolding, swearing, threatening, treason, and defying authority were all offences. The colonists were trying to control the language, and this set the pattern for their teaching of English. And as New England grew, this was how they did it, with the New England Primer.
A. In Adam's fall, sin to all. B. Heaven to find the Bible mind. C. Christ crucified for sinners died. D. The deluge drowned the earth around. E. Elijah
From the very beginning, Americans took immense care over the correct teaching of English. It was taught well and in a way that was highly religious, and this set the tone as English spread. It wasn't all going English's way, though. Other European powers were jostling for influence in the New World. Delaware, where a Swedish settlement had taken root, was conquered in 1655 by the Dutch Admiral Peter Stuyvesant and incorporated into the Dutch New Netherlands. His base, New Amsterdam, was in turn conquered by the British in 1664 and renamed New York. There was rivalry with the French, which turned into war. When it finally ended in 1763, Britain was given sole claim to the east of the continent and took a grip on the north in Canada. Even the Spanish colony of Florida came under British rule. But perhaps the real edge that gave English a stronger presence than the other European languages came not through the gun, but through the ploughshare. The Spanish, on the whole, concentrated on sending armies and priests to the New World and taking gold. The French were interested in sending fur trappers and trading with the natives. It was only the English who continued the spirit of the Pilgrim Fathers and came to stay. Persistence and sheer weight of numbers eventually ensured that English, not Spanish, Dutch or French, would be the language heard from the Atlantic coast to the Appalachian Mountains. But as English spread, it also started to develop a character of its own, to drift away from the language spoken in England. There was already the beginnings of the tomato-tomato problem. In some cases, meaning shifted. The English shop had become an American store. Lumber meant rubbish in the old country. To Americans, lumber was, and still is, cut timber. And haul came to mean to transport in a vehicle, not, as in England, to move by force. American English was also developing its own sound. The first settlers had come from various parts of England, each with its own regional accent. But no single accent dominated. As they talked to each other, the variety very quickly became a blend. To this day, there's only a tiny variation in accents across America compared to Britain, and the further west you go, the more true that becomes. By the middle of the 18th century, the absence of regional pronunciations and dialect words was being noted approvingly by upper-class British visitors, who regarded all such variations as vulgar. In 1764, Lord Gordon wrote, "The propriety of language here surprised me much. The English tongue being spoken by all ranks in a degree of purity and perfection surpassing any but the polite part of London." It's a sentiment that would be repeated again and again, that the Americans didn't just speak good English, they spoke it better than the English themselves. It wasn't only where language was concerned that the colonists began to stand up to the English. Tension was growing between them and the Crown. In 1775, here on this bridge at Concord in Massachusetts, 75 American volunteers confronted 700 British troops. One of them fired what has ever since been called, with a touch of hyperbole, the shot heard round the world. Revolution had begun. A year later, 13 colonies declared their independence and did so in perfect, what we might call classical English.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
John Adams, who had become the second President of the United States, wrote of a future in which all Americans spoke the language equally well, in which eloquence would be the way to high office, and no one would be excluded because their speech betrayed inferior origins. It was the birth of a democratic ideal that's still part of the American myth, that anyone can become president. Everyone would have a presidential vocabulary and accent. This was no longer the King's English, but perhaps the people's English, and they wanted to set it in stone. This is another foundation of America, not a rock, but a little blue book. It was written by a schoolteacher called Noah Webster. Through the last years of the 18th century and the 19th century, it was sold in countless general stores like this one, stacked among the tins of molasses and sacks of beans, the snake oils, paraffin lamps and shovels. It soon became known as the American Spelling Book, or the Blue-Backed Speller. It sold at 14 cents a copy, and in its first 100 years it sold 60 million copies, more than any other book in American history with the exception of the Bible. This is one of the most influential books in the history of English.
first word is academic. The first sound is A-C. Ac. Perfect. The next part is D-E-M. Dem. I-C. Ick. Altogether, academic. Democratic. D-E-M.
The hundreds of words and model sentences in Webster's book have been repeated by millions of children on countless occasions.
Altogether, democratic. Very nice.
And the practice is thought to have changed the sound of the language. To this day, Americans tend to pronounce words with a far more even emphasis than the English, and in particular than the clipped vowels of the English aristocracy, whose influence Webster wanted to oppose. Where the English say cemetery, the Americans have cemetery. English laboratory, American laboratory. But pronunciation wasn't all that he influenced. It was from this book that America learned how to spell. Correct spelling came to be seen as a standard of education and civilization throughout America, and it still is today. And the spelling bee became part of the life of every town and village.
This morning we're going to start our spelling lesson with practice for the spelling bee that we're going to be doing. The first word is syllable. Sometimes when you study words, you might break them into a syllable pattern.
Webster's book standardized spelling across America, and he also tried to improve on inconsistent and illogical spellings.
Correct. The next word is democracy.
D-E-M-O-C-R-Y.
Under Webster's system, honour, colour, and a score of similar words lost their U. Double letters were reduced to single ones, like the L in traveller or the G in wagon. ER replaced RE as the ending of theatre or centre. Defence with the C became defence with an S. Axe lost its E.
Axe.
A-X.
Perfect. I see you've all been doing your homework.
England had made the language, but America had begun to claim its future. By the 1820s, East Coast America was presenting itself confidently as the guardian of English, beating off vulgarity and fashion. There was even a cheeky motion proposed in the House of Representatives to invite the sons of the English aristocracy to come to America to learn how to speak properly. Americans felt they'd kept the English language pure for 200 years, so pure that they were still using words the English had dropped, words like a greenhorn, burly, deft, scant, talented, and likely. Americans still say sick to mean ill, not just nauseous. They say fall, meaning autumn, just as the English did once. And when Americans say I guess, they're using a form of words that would have been familiar to Chaucer, yes. And they denied that they were changing the language. When Webster published his groundbreaking American dictionary in 1828, he claimed that this, contained less than 50 terms that were new to the country. Here was America claiming to preserve English in all its past glories, to have erected a barrier against change and corruption. But they could no more exclude these natural developments in the language than the first colonists could hide behind their stockade from the world beyond. John Adams had predicted that America would drive the English language into a great future. His vision was prophetic. But the language would be very different from the measured East Coast tones that Adams had known. American English was going west and going wild. In 1804, the United States purchased what was then called Louisiana from the French for 3 cents an acre and more than doubled the size of the country overnight. And these lands were nothing less than the whole American heartland, the great plains and prairies drained by the Mississippi River and its tributaries like the Missouri, Ohio, and Tennessee. It stretched all the way from New Orleans in the south to the Rocky Mountains and what is today the Canadian border in the north. Jefferson, the president, sent an expedition of 45 men under the leadership of Captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark into the unknown interior in search of a navigable river route to the west coast. Lewis and Clark's expedition became one of the epic journeys in the history of exploration. It started here in St. Louis, on the great junction where the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers come together. Lewis and Clark were army-trained frontiersmen, backwoods specialists, and because Jefferson insisted on daily journals being kept, their expedition was recorded not in the Puritan language of faith, nor in Webster's urbane prose, but in the practical language of the frontier. And this is crucial, because it marks the beginning not only of the opening of the continent, but of the decline of the East Coast grip on American English.
We finished butchering the buffalo, and on my return to camp, I trod within a few inches of a rattlesnake, but fortunately escaped his bite. We also passed another creek, and a very bad rapid which reached quite across the river. A female elk and its fawn swum down through the waves which ran very high, hence the name of Elk Rapids, which we instantly gave this place. Opposite to these rapids there is a high bluff, and a little above on the larboard, a small cottonwood bottom in which we found sufficient timber for our fires and encampment.
These are words peculiar to America or in a peculiarly American use. In England, a creek is a tidal inlet. In America, it's broadened its meaning to cover all manner of streams. Adjectives turn into nouns, rapid into rapids. And bluff was coined here to describe flat cliffs. Rattlesnake was another of those descriptive combinations of English words, as was cottonwood. And elk is one of the words imported from England and applied to a different beast. Buffalo, though, had been an English word for over 2 centuries, imported from a Portuguese book about China. Lewis and Clark's journals include not Webster's 50 words peculiar to America, but over 2,000 of them. Most are names of objects, a great catalogue of flora and fauna and man-made items that were new to English eyes. Words like hickory, hominy, maize, moccasin, moose, opossum, pecan, persimmon, toboggan are derived from native languages, as well as more obscure words like kinnikinnick, a mixture of leaves for smoking, pemmican, a preserved mixture of meat, fat and berries, and tamarack, a kind of larch. Others are English coinages with descriptive properties of their own. The whippoorwill, a bird named by the sound of its call, or the mockingbird, a name inspired by its habit of imitating other birds' songs. And there are hundreds of names made by combining existing English words from black bear, bluegrass, bottomland, backtrack, box alder, brown thrush, buckeye, bullfrog, bald eagle, and blue jay, to sapsucker, snowberry, snowshoe, sugar maple, whistling swan, timberland, tumblebug, turkey buzzard, and yellowjacket. But this was just the beginning. In the wake of Lewis and Clark, the great rivers became America's superhighways. Once, this quayside in St. Louis, the gateway to the west, bustled with scores of paddle steamers taking new settlers to the new lands. This was the hub of the frontier in the 1830s and 40s. The very word immigrant is an American invention. Vast migrations of people had never been a huge factor in the old world, but it was the defining experience of the new one. And new settlers brought new linguistic energies. The Pilgrim Fathers had come primarily from the south and east of England, but 2 centuries on, Americans were as likely to come from Scotland, escaping the aftermath of the Highland clearances, or from Ulster, often driven out by famine, high rents, religious intolerance, or simply looking for the chance to make a new and better life. As many as half the population of Ulster crossed the Atlantic, and many kept moving west. They became a major part of the rich mix of people who were creating a new American country and a new American voice. Scots and Irish brought new words and expressions to America. The Scottish verb schoon, meaning to skim over water, took to the sea as a new type of ship, the schooner. The Irish donated the word cabin to name the typical frontier dwelling. They also brought dead, as in dead straight, and the similar use of plumb and right came to America through use by both Scots and Irish, as did the habit of sticking an A on the front of verbs like a-going. The old French presence too is apparent everywhere along the Mississippi. It's there in the place names from New Orleans, Baton Rouge and Lafayette in the south, to St. Louis, Cape Girardeau and Belleville further north, and towns ending in the French suffix ville are everywhere. Edwardsville, Greenville, Jacksonville, Clarksville. The French gave us the name of one of the great Western institutions, the hotel. America took a word the French had given to a grand private house or a municipal building and turned it into the name of a new invention, a palace for all the people, far grander in ambition than the inns and taverns that offered rest to travellers in England. And their clients were businessmen. In 18th century England, merchants had been described as businessmen, but now the word took on its modern American meaning, the mover and shaker, in the worlds of finance and expansion and opportunity. The country was on the move and on the make. The river teemed with poor migrants, rednecks, who got their name from the way their necks were burnt by the sun as they bent to work in the fields. Because they couldn't afford the steamboat fare, they travelled on rafts, which they steered with oars called riffs, so they were known as the riffraff. On board boats like this one, richer travellers were in turn regarded as highfalutin because of the high fluted smokestacks that carried soot and cinders well away from those passengers, and also perhaps because of the stovepipe hats those dudes wore. They bestrode the Texas deck, the biggest on the boat.
Ready to play? Gentlemen, this is 5-card stud.
Gambling was a favourite activity among the riverboat passengers. Pass the buck and the buck stops here both come from such card games. The buck was a buckhorn-handled knife passed round to show who was dealing. And they're just the start of the phrases that American gamblers gave to the language in the middle of the 19th century.
I'm assuming you have an ace, sir.
Deal became part of phrases like square deal, new deal,
Three.
fair deal, raw deal.
Dealer will take 3.
Big deal, no big deal.
And raise it 3.
I'll raise your bid, you bet, put up or shut up, and I'll call your bluff were all first heard around the card table.
I'll call you.
You have an ace up your sleeve, so you up the ante. Someone throws in his hand, but you keep a poker face. Now the chips are down, but the cards are stacked against you. Someone plays a wild card and scoops the jackpot.
Sevens. They're kings.
Nice.
Cheers. Gambling and drinking spread across the West, no surprise there. This was a very different frontier from the original one at Plymouth, and nothing added more slang words and phrases to the language than alcohol. Barroom and saloon both entered the language, soon followed by bartender and set 'em up. Measures like a snifter, a jigger and a finger all came from the bars of America. And bootlegging comes from the practice of hiding a flat bottle of whiskey in the leg of a boot to be sold illegally to the natives. And there were literally hundreds of terms for drunk. Even before the Revolution, Benjamin Franklin listed 229 of them, minted in America, including, he's casting up his accounts, his head is full of bees, he sees the bears, he's cherry merry, he's womble-cropped, he's halfway to Concord, he's ate a toad and a half for breakfast, he's grotable, he's globular, he's loose in the hills, he's intoxicated, he's juicy, he clips the King's English, he sees 2 moons, he's nip-topsical, he's oiled, he's like a rat in trouble, he's double-tongued, he's trammelled, he's got the Indian vapors, he's out of the way, he's very weary. Teetotal was another word that came into the language from the Irish settlers, along with speakeasy, shillelagh and smithereens, yes indeedy and no siree, and later of course came on the wagon. Westward expansion had long been the cause of land disputes between the settlers and the natives, and once they left the great rivers for the wagon routes like the Oregon and the Santa Fe trails, contact and often friction between migrants and Indians increased. Many of the Indian words that had already come into English reflected this antagonism. Scalp, a good old English noun, had become a far more threatening verb as early as 1693. Tomahawk was another early addition to the language. So were warpath, war whoop, war dance, and long knives, an Indian word for white man, and firewater, the term they gave to alcohol. Phrases like no can do or long time no see are literal translations from Indian languages. The word brave to describe Indian warriors was certainly inherited from the French, and buck, slang for a dollar, derives from buckskin, the standard unit of trade between Europeans and Indians. Conflict with the natives was just one of the hazards faced by the people who went west. Every one of them had an epic journey to tell of the hardships imposed by distance and the weather. Every one had carved a new life out of a landscape made on a scale unknown in Europe. They chose new American heroes for themselves, through whose stories they could distill their own experiences, and they chose them and told tales about them on a grand scale. The most famous of all straddled the gap between fact and fiction, Davy Crockett. He was, as we know from the song, born on a mountaintop in Tennessee. He was the son of a veteran of the Revolution. He became a congressman, famous for his plain speaking, and he died defending the Alamo in Texas in 1836. He was as American as they came, and he became a legend, the king of the wild frontier, the hero of a series of paper-bound books telling exaggerated stories about him. This fictionalized Crockett was the first great exponent of a style of speech as big as the country, called tall talk. When he opened his mouth, he made the forest shake.
These is times that come upon us like a whirlwind and an earthquake. They are come like a catamount at full jump. We are called upon to show our grit like a ball lightning against a pine log, to exterminate, mollify, and calumniate the foe. Pierce the heart of the enemy, cram his pesky carcass full of thunder and lightning like a stuffed sausage, and turtle him off with a red-hot poker. And while the stars of Uncle Sam and the stripes of his country wave triumphantly in the breeze, where is the craven, low-lived, chicken-bred, toad-hopping, red-mounted, bristle-headed mother-son of ye who will not raise the beacon light of triumph, snouse the citadel of the aggressor, and squeeze ahead to liberty and glory?
Confidence bred ornate Baroque words, shebang, shindig, and slumgullion, kaflop, kabang, and kathump. An American need not simply leave hurriedly, he could absquatulate or skedaddle. He didn't just use something up, he exflunkitated it. The language was hunky-dory, rambunctious, splendiferous. Its vigor was in speech, and that habit of coming up with vivid verbal images has left us with many that figure in everyday talk. It's not my funeral if you fly off the handle because you've a chip on your shoulder and an axe to grind. I won't sit on the fence and dodge the issue. I won't fizzle out. I won't crack up. No two ways about it. I'll knuckle down and make the fur fly. I'll go the whole hog and knock the spots out of you, and you'll be a goner. You'll kick the bucket. So face the music. You're barking up the wrong tree. You won't get the drop on me. I'm in cahoots with some people with the know-how. Keep a stiff upper lip and have the horse sense to pull up stakes, okay? Within 2 generations of the opening of Louisiana, the American language had been reborn. No legislator sitting in a library in one of the eastern states could have hoped to arrest its exuberant progress. It's a fact that the biggest author of the language is Anon. This was the democratic language that Adams had foreseen, but democracy meant that everyone threw in their 2 cents worth, and the old conservative values were trampled in the movement west. And never quicker than when gold was discovered in them thar hills. Gold fever brought tens of thousands of people from the eastern states, and their letters home were loaded with new words. Prospector was one. They wrote about how they'd staked their claim, about how they hoped that gold dust would pan out of the water that they were sieving, or they would strike it lucky or strike it rich and produce a bonanza, which came from the Spanish word for fair weather. And for the first time, a surefire investment became known colloquially as a gold mine. And the gold rush gave us 2 words that became far more famous in the 20th century. When a certain Levi Strauss started to make hard-wearing clothes for miners, he used a cloth called jean fustian, originally made in Genoa. Levi's and jeans have been as American as Stars and Stripes ever since. The arrival of the railroad was what really opened up the country, and it created the industry that gave the West its most characteristic vocabulary. It was a certain Joseph McCoy who had the idea of driving cattle often hundreds of miles to railheads so that they could be exported to the markets back east. Previously, they'd only been butchered for local use. Overnight, McCoy became immensely rich. So rich, the story goes, that other envious souls used to try to pass themselves off as the man who had such a simple but brilliant idea. And so he developed the habit of introducing himself to strangers as the real McCoy. He gave the world a catchphrase, and he also gave it the cowboy. English had known the word cowboy since the 18th century, but now it took on a new currency and a new meaning. McCoy's brainwave turned the cattle industry into a license to print money and the cowboy into a national icon. Cowboys had been working near the Mexican border for years, picking up Spanish words, which now drove north with them. Ranch comes from the Spanish, as does corral, where horses or cattle were penned. Mustang, bronco, and the more humble burro, the chaps, sombrero and poncho they might wear, the cinch that secured the saddle, the lariat and the lasso they used to rope cattle, the sierras, mesas and canyons they rode across, the cries of vamoose and pronto, the stampede that they feared, and the rodeo where they drove the cattle together, all came from Spanish. The language of the West has become the standard idea of what American English is like, completely overtaking the proper speech of the East. And the man who is virtually single-handedly responsible for this was one of the greatest showmen and boosters of them all. He was William F. Cody, Buffalo Bill, and he chose to be buried here, on the hills above Denver, where the Rockies rise steeply out of the Great Plains. He turned the frontier experience into an epic entertainment, Buffalo Bill's Wild West. The extravaganza featured live elk and buffalo, real Indians attacking a stagecoach, sharpshooting displays, musical cowboys in spotless outfits that had never seen a cattle drive, and a reenactment of Custer's last stand at Little Bighorn, in which Buffalo Bill himself arrived on the scene just too late to save the day. It was nonsense, and it was a smash across America and Europe for 30 years, long after Indian resistance had ended and the last buffalo herd had been massacred. It created a vogue for the language of the West and began a line of Western myth that kept that language alive through countless books and films. And the dreams of luxury and optimism became an enduring fantasy of a Western El Dorado, an Eden, somewhere over the rainbow, or at least the next county line. It's all there in a little song about the hobos, another good frontier word, who rode the railways west in search of their own American dream.
In the big rock candy mountains, you never change your socks, and the little streams of alcohol come a-trickling down the rocks. The brakemen have to tip their hats, and the railroad bulls are blind. There's a lake of stew and a whiskey too. You can paddle all around them in a big canoe in the big rock candy mountains.
But there was another group of Americans who'd never been invited to share that dream, the black slave population of the South. And they spoke about their experiences in a very different language.
I'll see you all this coming fall in the big rock candy mountains.
This is Sullivan's Island, a little patch of land in Charleston Harbor off the coast of South Carolina. It was the first taste of America for hundreds of thousands of immigrants in the 18th and 19th centuries. But the immigrants who came through here hadn't chosen the American dream of a better life. They had been sold into slavery. Sullivan's Island was a holding pen for imported slaves. Between half and two-thirds of them entered America here, before being sold on mainly to work on the cotton plantations. There's no Statue of Liberty here, just this plaque, erected in 1999 to commemorate their arrival. They came here from the countries of West Africa and from plantations in the Caribbean. Slaves who spoke different languages were put together on the same sea voyage here to stop them plotting together to seize control of the ship. So on ship and on shore, there was a great babel of languages. The slaves had to find a tongue in which to talk to one another and to their masters. It was English, but English very heavily influenced by African ways of talking.
Then you all get home and put his board and get it washed up in the fat. Yes, next thing you know, the man and knock on the door.
Where the knock for?
Yes, sir. So you just been out in the creek just now? Yes, sir. Just come up the creek, sir.
Yeah.
I tell you, you take the gully out of your fake and anything, you have a spot of tea.
The language these people are talking is Gullah, which has survived as a distinct variety of English here around the South Carolina islands.
This fella come here and walk up on the bank and say, what are you doing up on that bank there? And he said, don't you notice
It's thought by many people to be the closest we can get to the kind of language that would have been spoken by the slaves in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and that this is the origin of modern Afro-American vernacular.
After John get off about 50 feet off, and John look over there.
Yeah.
And he go on his boat, and he look, his boat done sank down. He start hollering, "Hey, help, help!" John said, "I ain't rough as yet."
We put together varying African words along with Elizabethan English and came out with something that sounded like a this year when Hana the Yeti we talk like a this. So sometimes people think maybe it's English, then they go, but not quite. There were Igbos, Mandinkas, Malinkes, Yorubas, Golas, Gidzi, Afik, Mende that were all kidnapped, captured, and then isolated together on these islands during enslavement.
Once the slaves reached the plantations, they lived in cabins like these beside the main house. Here, many words that came into Gullah from African languages have found their way into standard English. Words such as banana, which comes from the Wolof language spoken in Senegal, and voodoo, traceable to an African word for spirit in the language spoken by the Yoruba people. Other African words which have entered standard English include the animals zebra, gorilla and chimpanzee, the musical terms samba, mambo, banjo and bongo, and the food and plant names guba, meaning peanut, yam and gumbo, meaning okra. African compound words were translated, giving English terms like badmouse. And nitty-gritty originated as a term for the grit that accumulated in the bilges of slave ships. As well as vocabulary, Gullah employs some grammatical features that differ from standard English.
If someone say, "Hana going for do that," I be done do 'em. Okay? So they're asking, "Are you going to do it?" I already did it. And I did it a long time ago, essentially, is what you're saying. I be done do 'em. I done do that. You see? So if you hear somebody say, "I done do that," that means they did it and they did it a long time ago. And why are you asking me it? Oh, again, basically. So it's a lot more going into it. So if someone said, "Well, Hunter going over there," Hunter done yet they say you're going over there. I be done yet that. But it done do that too. But I been going there, but it ain't be did it. Why Hunter ain't be did it? When I be did it, Hunter ain't be did it. You see? So it's like, well, you were going over there. Yeah, I already went there. But when I went, you weren't there. But I was there. But you're right. I wasn't there when you were there.
Phrases like these have a rich and economical expressiveness. In other ways, Gullah and other Black Englishes have stripped down their grammar. They drop verbs like is, use don't where standard English says doesn't, and omit the apostrophe and s that standard English uses as a sign of ownership. This kind of simplification is common when languages meet and emerge as a new hybrid. It's exactly what happened when Saxons and Danes dealt with each other in England in the 9th century and changed English grammar forever. But in this case, the changes were mistakenly taken by many white observers as evidence that black speakers just hadn't got the intelligence to speak the language properly, that they were simply trying and failing to copy white speech. In fact, they were adding to the language.
Now listen, yeah, you know, some people say they're your friend and thing, but they ain't always your friend. Like that bird rabbit, that boy know he ain't nothing to him. You hear what I say? That cutter was slow motion, and that bird rabbit just as slick as him wanna be.
But black speakers had their own tradition of performances that showed just how flexible and expressive their language was. They told stories, and they're still told today.
And now Hong Tong come, ruff, 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 ruff. And oh, I tell you, bird rabbit, he'll take off and lickety split.
Brer Rabbit is a direct descendant of animal tricksters who feature in African folklore.
I say, Bird Rabbit, you to tell the truth about Cutter? He said, yes, sir, ma'am. I say, you lie, ting, ain't no truth in you. Ain't no truth in you, no way.
But folk tales weren't the only thing that fueled dreams of freedom. With English, the slaves had learned Christianity. White society thought it would teach obedience. The Bible became as central to the lives of the slaves as it had been to the first settlers in New England. But the message they found in it wasn't obedience. It was liberty. Once again, the Bible in English became the book of freedom.
Yeah, Jesus calling.
Who now want for God?
Yeah, Jesus calling.
Whoa. Who now want for God?
And he's calling for the sinner.
Who now want for God? Oh, children, who now beg for get ready? Jesus be coming back. Who now want for God?
Steal away from Jesus.
By the first decade of the 19th century, the American states in the North had abolished slavery.
Steal away home.
the blacks of the South sang Steal Away or One More River to Cross or Bound for Canaan Land, they were introducing new words and sounds into the language, and they were also singing not just about the next world, but about this one, about the hope of escaping to the north and to freedom. The chains of slavery were rusting, and on the 12th of April 1861, in the early hours of the morning, shots were fired at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, just behind me. This was the start of the American Civil War, which the North, of course, was to win. 4 years later, Confederate forces abandoned Charleston. The Union Army marched in unopposed. They freed the slaves.
Glory, glory, hallelujah.
The promise in the language of their spirituals had come good for the black people of Charleston.
Glory, glory.
The American Civil War gave us the phrase, hold the fort. And the first people to hear anything on the grapevine were in the southern states, where army telegraph lines strung in the trees became so knotted that they were said to look like grapevines.
Oh, you got to ask the Lord's forgiveness.
There was plenty of resistance to the new order. The Ku Klux Klan, who apparently derived their name from the Greek word kuklos, meaning circle, were formed in the aftermath of the war. They gave English the word bulldozer, originally a bull dose, meaning a dose large enough for a bull. It was a dose of whipping, and it was administered to black people, often fatally. Words like bulldoze are a savage reminder that the end of the war didn't bring the end of segregation and prejudice. In theory, blacks and their language were now free to mix with whites, but in practice, it was only in the 20th century that the mixing of vocabularies really began, that, just like in the plantation houses, white speakers started to ape black speech, and cool was born. And that's a story for a later program. Even after the Civil War, very few white people treated black language with any interest or respect. One who did was a man who'd grown up on the Mississippi and was fascinated by all of its talk, black and white. Luckily for us, he was a genius. When he made writing his profession, he chose as his pen name a call that he'd heard the riverboatmen use to sound a depth of 2 fathoms, Mark Twain. And the river runs through Twain's greatest book, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It's set in the years before the Civil War, and it's the story of a young boy who escapes what he disdainfully calls the civilizing influence of his Aunt Sally. Huck takes to the river on a raft in the company of an escaped slave called Jim. In his introduction, Twain told his readers that he'd taken great pains to capture the different dialects of the river. A southerner talks music, he once wrote, and when he'd Huck Finn describe life on the river, he found its melody.
It's lovely to live on a raft. We had the sky up there, all speckled with stars, and we used to lay on our backs and look up at them and discuss about whether they was made or only just happened. Jim allowed that they was made, but I allowed that they happened. I judged it would have took too long to make so many. Jim said the moon could have laid 'em. Well, that looked kind of reasonable, so I didn't say nothing against it, because I seen a frog lay most as many. We used to watch the stars that fell, too, see 'em streak down. Jim allowed that they got spoiled and was hove out of the nest.
This is a new voice in the American record, that of the common man and the frontier. English has come a long way from the sober and sacred language that the Puritans had first brought to New England. It has changed its sound, and it has changed its character. Words were no longer solely vehicles for God's truth. There were also words that offended. The East Coast wasn't yet ready to relinquish its self-appointed role as guardian of the language. Back here at Concord, the cradle of the Revolution, the civilized Aunt Sallies who sat on the Library Committee banned Huckleberry Finn for its vernacular language. It was, they said, couched in a rough, ignorant dialect, and that there was a systematic use of bad grammar and an employment of inelegant expressions. But though the Library Committee might call Twain's language vulgar, it couldn't ban the vigour of English that had grown up away from the East Coast, American English. Huck's closing words defied their attempt to control it.
There ain't nothing more to write about, and I am rotten glad of it, because if I'd have known what a trouble it was to make a book, I wouldn't have tackled it and ain't a-going to no more. But I reckon I got a light out for the territory ahead of the rest, 'cause Aunt Sally, she's gonna adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I've been there before.
And the vigour continued to increase in the late 19th century. New waves of immigrants flooded into America. Germans, Italians, Greeks, Russians, Jews, from all across Europe they came to a land that promised to give a new home to the tired, poor, huddled masses, longing to breathe free. To become American was their dream, and for almost all of them, that meant that they wanted their children to speak the language of the new country. They would power the adventure of English into the 20th century.